sitting on a server somewhere, and when a user requests a given page, that server sends over the related files as is to the user. Contrast this with a dynamic website in which your server includes a database or some kind of data store, and then a system like Drupal or WordPress or perhaps some ASP.NET scripts, so that when the user requests a given web page, that system will query that database or data store to pull in some information and then build those web pages on the fly and then send the result back to the user. And dynamic websites are how all of the LTER sites are implemented to some degree, with the exception of the BLE or my own website. EDI also uses a dynamic website, and there's good reason for this. They have lots of advantages, and they've been in use quite a bit in the web for the past decade or so. But static websites can have some advantages too. And so in this webinar, I'm going to explore what some of those advantages are and test whether a static website would really be appropriate for an LTER site. Why go static? Well, they can be very secure. Because there is no database on your server to support your website, your server is not subject to SQL injection attacks. Your website just consists of a pile of files that's sitting there. There's not much that a malicious user can do to those. This leads me to my next point about how static websites and the servers associated with them tend to be very low maintenance with respect to the servers themselves. And this is because you don't have to worry about those SQL injection attacks. You don't have to deal with software updates related to your content management system, like the latest security flaw with Drupal and the associated patch. You don't have to deal with that. In fact, you can get away with not maintaining a server at all because it's so easy to host just a pile of files. It's so easy to host a static website. You can find hosts out there for your website for free. And so you can let some other company manage your servers or manage their servers for you. So you don't have to worry about operating system enhancements or upgrades, for example. You just have to worry about the content on your website itself. This leads us into the cost factor. Like I said, there are free hosts out there for static websites, and some of these hosts will give you a free SSL certificate. This is a way of having HTTPS or secure transactions between the end user's web browser and the web server hosting your website. And then by communicating with the LTER Network Communications Office about the location of your website on whatever host is hosting it, they can create an alias for you so that you get your 3-letter acronym for your site, then .lternet.edu. In other words, you get a free address for your website. That's consistent with a lot of the other LTER websites out there. Static websites can be very fast. This is because the files associated with your website are already built ahead of time. There's no looking inside of a database and trying to build a web page on the fly. Everything's already just sitting there waiting to be downloaded. Static websites can also take advantage of something called a content delivery network because these websites are so easy to host. What I can do is, once I have my pile of files that represents my website, I can replicate these files on servers located around the world. This becomes my content delivery network. If one server goes down due to maintenance or perhaps because it did have some kind of security flaw that I didn't anticipate, other servers can pick up the slack. Also, if there's a user in Japan who wants to access my website, they don't have to get to my website from some server in Texas. Their web browser will be automatically directed to the closest content delivery network node to them, leading to shorter download times or page load times for the website. Finally, I tend to find static websites easier to work with. This may be reflecting my bias in that I already know HTML, CSS, and JavaScript to some degree. But I love the degree of control that I have. I've worked with some content management systems in the past, and I find that when a given theme or a set of plugins, when they do what you want them to do, they're actually very, very awesome. I love them. But more often than not, I find that there's always some little thing that doesn't look quite right with my website from a given content management system theme. And figuring out how to adjust that theme to make it do exactly what you want can be very challenging. Whereas with a static website, the website that I see tends to be whatever I programmed up, whatever I coded in HTML or CSS or JavaScript. And so I already have that knowledge about how the website is really working behind the scenes. And even if I didn't, it's not that big of a deal to open up an HTML file and find a couple of lines in there and edit them to make my website look how I want. At least that's my own experience. I also like how easily shareable static websites are. I can literally give you a zip file of the BLE LTER website, and you can unzip that on your computer and double click the home page, and it will open up in your web browser right away. You didn't have to set up a server at all. Compare that to what you would have to do if you had something like Drupal installed, where in addition to giving a user the files related to my website, that user would also have to set up their own Drupal instance somewhere and configure everything before they even start thinking about what they're going to do with the files that I sent over. So because of this shareability aspect of static websites, I think there may be some potential for collaboration, just like there have been for some of the other website-based projects like Deems that's out there right now for Drupal. I think we can perhaps do some of the same kind of sharing and collaboration with static solutions. So that sounds interesting, but can a static website really do all of the things that we need an LTER website to do? And in particular, I wanted to look at some of these perhaps dynamic elements that's required of an LTER website, like site search, publication search, and the data catalog. And so I went through a series of experiments where I explored these various aspects and what elements that static websites might have to support these. I'll start with the site search experiment. Site search is when the user enters a search term and they expect to see a list of search results that point them to different pages on your website. In other words, they're searching for content directly on your website, not necessarily a set of publications or some data sets that you may have archived. There are some pretty good site search contenders out there for static websites, and a lot of these tend to be service-based. I know that some of the LTER websites right now are using things like Google Custom Search Engine. Now, keeping with the spirit of a static website being so cheap or even free to operate, I wanted to look just at the free tiers of these various service-based approaches. And I found that there was always some catch whenever you go with the free tier. Of course, nothing's for free, right? It seems like. For example, some of them may inject ads into the search results. For some of them, you may have to deal with that company's branding being placed into the search box itself. Or you may have monthly limits on the number of searches that your users can perform before you start getting charged for that service. So because of this, I shifted my focus more to a local search option. So with a local option, instead of my users' search queries going out to a Google server somewhere, for example, and then Google spitting back results, that search happens entirely based on files that come from my web server, and the work happens in the user's browser. And so in addition to downloading my web page, they also download a search index file, which all happens behind the scenes. And then when they enter a search term, their web browser does the work of looking through that search index to find relevant pages. The big contender that I found in the local site search field is a package called Lunr. And so I set up an experiment to work with Lunr, and this is a project on GitHub. By the way, if you want to look at any of the GitHub projects that I'll be talking about in this webinar, it's probably easiest just to go to my profile page in GitHub rather than trying to remember or write down the very long and uncreative names that I tend to come up with for my GitHub repositories. If you just go to github.com/twhitaker, you should be able to see a Lunr project there. That is the project I'm talking about right now. The basic procedure for working with Lunr is you install Lunr, which it is of course freely available. You can use some HTML code then to add a search box to your website. And then you'll use Lunr to build a search index based on files in your website. To build that search index, you simply open up a command window somewhere near where your website files are located, and you run a build index script. This script will crawl through all of your pages in your website and spit out a single file that represents your search index. Then it's just a matter of uploading that search index to whatever web server is hosting your other web pages. So let's see a demo of Lunr in action. I've exited out of my slides for now, and I've got a web browser open pointing to my GitHub profile page. I see the Lunr project there, so I'll click that. And this page tells you about what this project is about, along with prerequisites for installing Lunr, how to build the search index, how to use the index. But over here on the right-hand side, there's a green button to clone or download this repository. So I'll download a zip file of this entire project and extract the contents to a folder on my computer. Inside the folder, I see that build index script that I was talking about in my slides. So that's what I would use to build my search index. I also see an example static website that's included in this project. Inside there, you see the kinds of files that are associated with websites, like HTML files, JavaScript files, and CSS files. Index.html is typically the home page for a website. If I double-click that, the site opens in my browser, and I can see it's just a very simple page about things that I like, with some other pages that go into more detail about those things. So I've got fruits here. Let's see, and here's a page saying that I like mango and mangosteen and limes. I'll click back, and I see I have other pages about cats and dogs, so I like dogs that are furry and have tails and have noses. Okay. And then down at the bottom here, there's a link for a search page. So on this page, there's a search box. If I enter a search term like mango, I get a search result, as I would expect. My fruits page mentions that I like mango. So this search happened from a file that's located on my own computer here. You can see the web address just says file and then the location of where these files are extracted. I did not have to set up any kind of special server at all to run this static website. It's that simple. But let's suppose I want to make a change to this website. What would that involve? Well, I can go into my fruits page over here on the right-hand side and edit that with a simple text editor. For this webinar, I'll be using a free text editor called Notepad++, but you can use any text editor that you choose, or you can use a fancier editor for HTML files if you choose. So this is HTML code, or the code behind web pages. It tells your web browser how the web page is structured and what the content is. So I'll add some content indicating that I like peaches as well. I'll save that and then refresh the page in my browser. And sure enough, peaches appears. That looks good, but what if I go back to the search page and I search for peaches? I don't get any results, and that's because if you're working with a static website, then you have to update that search index anytime you make an update to your website. So let's see how that's done. I'll go back up a level in my pile of files sitting here, and I do see that build index script that I can use to build my search index. But before I can use it, I need to install Lunr. Let's see how that's done. I've got a command window open here, so I'll navigate into that folder that I just downloaded from GitHub. And then to install Lunr, I'll just enter this command, npm install Lunr. And this is all documented with, if you go to Lunr's website, you can see how to install things. While I'm at it, I'm going to install another package called Cheerio, and this is used to crawl through different pages on a website. Once those packages are installed, I will run that build index script. And it happened so fast, I should have made this web page bigger so I have more to talk through while it's processing. But the search index is already built. It's called Lunr Index, and it's sitting right here. And so all that script did was crawl through my various web pages and build up the index. I'll show you what that index looks like. Here it is in my text editor, and it's just a big old pile of stuff. Hard for a human to read, but programs like your web browser can read it pretty easily. And if I look for the word peach, yes, sure enough, the word peach does appear there in this search index, so I know that it's updated. I'll drag that new search index into my example website, overriding the existing index that was there from the GitHub project. Now, whenever I click the search button in my browser, the search for peaches returns a result, and it takes me back to my fruits page where I have peaches. So that's what it would take to update your search index if you're using a static website in Lunr. So the example experiment worked here. Let's see how this might work in the wild. This is my actual BLE website for the Beaufort Lagoon Ecosystems LTER, and I have a search box here that's powered by Lunr. If I search for precipitation, I get a search result. Apparently, I talked about precipitation on our About page. But now let's suppose I want to search for rainfall. Well, rainfall is a form of precipitation, and some might loosely consider it to be a synonym of precipitation, but I don't get any results when I search for rainfall. This brings me back to my slides. So after evaluating Lunr in this way, I concluded that I love that it's free. I like that there's no branding, there are no ads or gotchas like that associated with using Lunr. But it does have some cons compared to some of the service-based approaches. For example, a lot of those service-based approaches can handle synonyms. They can also handle typos. You've probably typed in a word, maybe like iceberg, but you misspelled it. Well, in your favorite search engine, you probably saw search results for what you intended to search for anyway, and maybe a little sentence that said, "Did you mean to search for iceberg? Here are some results." So you can get these kinds of features from these service-based solutions, but not necessarily from a static Lunr-based solution, at least not without some work. Another disadvantage of Lunr is a potential scalability issue. You can imagine as you build more pages to your site, your search index is going to get bigger and bigger. And based on my experimentation, it seems like if you were to approach between 100 and 1,000 pages on your website, depending on the content on those pages, of course, your search index would exceed 1 megabyte in size. And so for your mobile device users who are operating over a slow 3G connection, your search page would take a few seconds to load. And that doesn't look good for your website. Many of you may not have this kind of issue. I certainly don't have over 100 or anywhere near 1,000 pages for my website currently, but I may if I were to add a blog or some other pages that would be created regularly over time. So something to think about for the long term, but at least for my case, I'm not that concerned about it right now. So I consider the site search experiment to be mostly a success, possible scalability issue in the future where I may want to go to one of those service-based solutions. But for now, I'm pretty happy with Lunr, and that's what I'm actively using on our BLE website. Let's move on to the next experiment regarding publication search. What I want to do here is to allow a user to provide a keyword like groundwater and get back a list of publications related to my LTER site. There are already some contenders in this field that can help you do this. And I'm showing 3 of the big ones here. And the one that I gravitate toward is Zotero. After looking at the programming interface for all 3 of these, I like the balance that Zotero has between being easy to use, but also powerful if you want to try more advanced searches. And the documentation behind how to use Zotero for this purpose seems better fleshed out than the other 2, in my opinion. So that's why I chose Zotero, for this experiment at least. So Zotero is a free tool to organize your references. You can create accounts for free. You can also create groups. And so the idea is I would have eventually an LTER group for the BLE LTER in Zotero. You can make these items or resources in your Zotero groups public or private, depending on how much you want to share. I would probably just have a public one for my LTER group. At least public to look at the items, not necessarily public to join my group and start adding items to it. And Zotero, like the other services out there, has an online API that stands for Application Programming Interface. That means in addition to using your web browser to look at items in a group, you can use programs to do so. That means I can write a program for my web page whereby I have a search box and then the user enters a search term and it goes out to Zotero behind the scenes and pulls back search results, all with JavaScript, all within that user's web browser. As it turns out, the LTER network maintains a group and it has about 20,000 items in it. And I presume these are items that are aggregated from the various LTER sites. So it's nice to see that it's already being used for LTER applications. I set up a GitHub project just to test out Zotero, so another very simple project like the Lunr one you saw earlier. If you want to use Zotero, the basic procedure is to create a Zotero group and then add some publications to it. you can see the latest draft LTER website guidelines for tips on how to tag your publications to make them more easily discoverable. You can download the code linked above from GitHub. And then once you've got that code downloaded, if you want to try it out, you just need to update the Zotero script file. This is just a text file, and you would change the group ID I have in there to whatever your Zotero group ID is. Save it, close it, and then open up the demo page in your web browser. And this is just a static website, so it should open right away on your computer, and you can start querying for publications from your LTER group. Let's continue our journey into risky business by doing another live demo of Zotero this time. I'll go back to my GitHub profile page, and I see a link for the Zotero JavaScript search client. So I click that, and I'll close some of these other windows that I don't need anymore over here on the left. Or right, that is. So here's my GitHub project for Zotero, and you can read about it if you want to, but I'm going to click this green button on the right to download. Actually, you know what? Let's just show a live demo of this. I do have links for the Lunr example and the Zotero example to a live demo. Remember, it's so easy to host a static website that these example websites I've got are hosted somewhere out there in the internet world for free. So if I click this link, it takes me to a web page hosted at rawgit.com, where I see that I'm searching the LTER group that has this Zotero group ID. And if you don't give me any search terms, I'm going to give you back a listing of all the items from this group. And you can see that there are almost 20,000 items. I get something like a bibliographical entry for each item, and I'm only showing the first 10 here. And then I've got pagination to show you, to give you links to the rest of these items. I'll click to go to the very end of this list. And once I go to the end, I start to see some strange stuff like 51233, ND. And so what's happening here is I'm obviously not supplying quite enough filters when I'm accessing that Zotero API behind the scenes. I'm sure the LTER network has further tagged these various items to distinguish them from whatever 51233 is to what formal publications may be tagged as. And so if I were to do this search for my own site, I would know how things are tagged, and I would include those appropriate tags as I query Zotero to give me back just the items that I want end users to see. Let's see if the filters for search terms works. If I enter a term groundwater and click search, instead of 20,000 results, now I just get 101 results, presumably relevant to groundwater. You may have noticed that once I enter these queries, I get a very long URL or link shown here just below that search box. This is the actual link that the code behind this static website is using to query Zotero for these search results. If I click that link, it takes me out to zotero.org, and you can see the raw data that comes back from that query. Let me maximize this window so you can see in the URL how the query is even structured. If you look in this URL, not too closely because I know it's kind of busy, but you'll see there's a Q equals groundwater term in there. Well, that's the part of the URL that I use to enter my search term. If I wanted to play with Zotero and not even have to worry about setting up my own website or downloading any files at all I'd have to do is enter a URL into my web browser, kind of like this one. And here I've changed the query to water from groundwater, and I get back a different set of search results. So you can play with these URLs to see how Zotero works. But I'll go back to the groundwater results, and I'll drag this window over to the right-hand side so you can compare it to what's happening on the left. Now, Firefox is trying to make this data look pretty for me, but this is what the raw data looks like. It's not too bad, really. This is a simple text format called JSON, and all the text that I've selected there represents the very first search result corresponding to this bibliographical entry on the left here in my web page. And then I have other search results in this same raw data set, obviously. The reason I want to show you this JSON is that you not only get back that bibliographical entry, but you get back a lot of other data. In fact, I'm not asking for probably 5% of what Zotero can give you back. It's pretty cool, actually. One thing I am asking for is this element called bib. And what this has inside of it is HTML code for a nicely formatted bibliographical entry. So what I can do then is just directly insert that HTML code under the bib element into my web page, so I don't have to worry about creating that formatting myself. Zotero is doing it for me. I guess that's another reason why I like using Zotero. It just makes my life easier as a JavaScript programmer. Now this brings me back to my slides. So you saw how I was messing around with the parameters in that URL that was querying Zotero. Here are some of the useful ones that you may want to work with if you're also going to play with Zotero. There's the include parameter, which tells Zotero what data to send back to me. I'm just including that bibliographical element. But if you don't like the way that that was formatted, if you want to apply your own formatting to it, then you can instead tell Zotero to give you back the author, the title, the year, and you can assemble that information however you want to in your web page. I am sorting in reverse chronological order based on that sort equals date parameter, and I'm limiting the search results to about 10. I find that if you go up to, let's say, 100, for example, that it takes so long for that data set to come back from Zotero that it's going to make your website appear sluggish, and that's not a very nice end user experience. And so I find that 10 is a pretty good number for Zotero. Well, I'm very happy with how Zotero was working for me for this publication search. And the BLE site doesn't have any publications yet. We just got started in August of last year, but I'm looking forward to using it. Let's move on to the next experiment. This is the data catalog. These are the data sets that I have archived through my site to some repository out there, and I would like a user to be able to search for data sets and find relevant results. For this experiment, I'm going to play with Pasta Plus. This is the API behind the Environmental Data Initiatives repository. In case you missed it, EDI gave a wonderful webinar on Pasta Plus last month, and there's a link to it. If you go to EDI's webpage, resources, EDI on YouTube, you'll find a video of that webinar. So it gives you a good introduction into their API, or Application Programming Interface, describing how you can build your own data catalog on your website without having to main a local copy of some database or something. You can just query their archive for the relevant information. So the way that you would test out Pasta Plus using the sample GitHub project that I've set up is you just simply download the code from GitHub, update the pasta.js script file so that it's pointing to your site instead of whatever the example site that I set up is. Then you run the demo page and it should work. Let's see a demo of this Pasta Plus experiment. I'll go back to my GitHub profile page, and I don't see the Pasta Plus experiment here on my profile page, so if I just click repositories, I can scroll down and there's Pasta. So I am going to download this one, just because it's so fun to download static websites and use them. By the way, if you do download a static website and open it up on your computer, make sure you're getting it from a trusted source. Don't just download anything out there and start running code on your computer. So I downloaded a zip file of that Pasta example, and I set it into my demos folder here on my computer. And inside there, it's just a very simple website. I've got one web page called demo and then some associated files. So if I run that web page, I see a very simple website open where I'm searching the FCE, or Florida Coastal Everglades LTER. And it looks a lot like that Zotero example, doesn't it? Except this case, I have the ability to filter by LTER core area and to enter a search term. So let's filter by disturbance. And whereas I was showing all 166 data sets from FCE, if I search with disturbance set, I now only see 5 results. So the filter is working. If anyone from FCE is online right now, they can tell me if my search isn't working correctly. Let's enter a search term. I'll do water. And now my search results are further filtered. So with water in the disturbance core area, I now only have 4 results. I'll open up one of those results so you can see what's happening with that. So to keep this website simple, what I'm doing is just showing you the title of that data set, the authors, and the publication year. And then when you click a link for a given data set, I actually take you out to the LTER network data portal, where you see there very nicely rendered metadata with an interactive map and the ability to download the individual files or the zip archive. In other words, I'm letting the network data portal do the heavy lifting for me of fully describing that data set. And on my page, I just want to give users the foot in the door to get after the data sets that they really want. Let's see what it would take to update this application to work with a different LTER site. Over here in my pile of files for this static website, I'll edit the Pasta JavaScript file. So here I am in my text editor, Notepad++, but it would work in any text editor you choose. And all I have to do is update the filter in here so that it's pointing to a different site. And the BLE site doesn't have any data sets yet, so I'll use the Virginia Coastal Reserve as my guinea pig. So I've set this filter to VCR. By the way, whether or not this would work for your site depends on if you have tagged or provided metadata in the same way that FCE and VCR has to the EDI archive. They have this KMB-LTER- and then their three-letter acronym within the metadata. And so that's what I'm using to make sure I'm only getting back results for their sites. So I'll save that file, and while I'm at it, I'm going to edit my demo page too, just for cosmetic reasons, to indicate that I'm searching the VCR site and not the FCE site anymore. Once I've made those changes, I'll refresh this existing page so that we're still filtering by disturbance and water, but instead of 4 search results, after I refresh, I get 49 results for the VCR site. And sure enough, I've got some results that appeared to be in Virginia. So that's a good sign that this may be working correctly. And that's how easy it is to have your own local data catalog without actually having to maintain your own database of all the data sets that you've archived. You can piggyback off of Pasta Plus. And just like with the Zotero example, if you want to play with that Pasta Plus API, you can see this link here that you can click based on that query to see how to formulate that query and then what comes back. In this case, Pasta Plus is giving me back an XML document, just another text file format that you can easily parse with code. Let's jump back to my slides. So that demo was for Pasta Plus for archiving data at EDI. As it turns out, for the BLE site, I'm going to be archiving my data at the Arctic Data Center. That's because the Beaufort Lagoons are located on the northern coast of Alaska. So the Arctic Data Center makes good sense for that. And they don't use Pasta Plus. They use another interface called Solar. And it's very similar, but it has some slight tweaks to it. And so I have created a sample static website that uses Solar as well. And that's what I'll eventually be using for my own BLE website. So I'm very happy with this data catalog experiment. Turned out pretty well, pretty easy to do. So then I moved on to what I call the website experiment. Thus far I've talked about the 3 individual modules on the bottom of this. Well, how would all that look if you were to package it together into a website that has your homepage, about page, your people page, and all that? Well, for this experiment, BLE's website is the experiment. I've got all of my website files for the BLE LTER located in GitHub. And then that repository is replicated in a content delivery network around the world. And when you go to the ble.lternet.edu address in your browser, it goes to one of those nodes in that content delivery network. Let's see a quick demo of what's going on with the BLE website itself. I'll close some of these pages that I'm not using anymore. And then back on my profile page, I don't see the LTER website project here. So I'll click my repositories, and there it is, LTER website, which happens to be my BLE website. And I can click to download this GitHub project. I'll download a zip file, extract it to my computer, and then I'll find my index.html file, open it up, and there is the BLE website downloaded just like that and now up and running on my own computer here, just for evaluating it. So I like how easy it is to work with these static websites in this way, to just download some files and see how they look right away without having to set up a server. But let's suppose that an end user wanted to play with this. Well, right now I don't know that I would recommend y'all getting out there and downloading this for use on your own LTER site. As you can see, because the BLE project is just underway, we only have this home page, a very simple about page, and then a directory page, a people page, basically. And of course, that Lunr search box. So I don't have any links to bibliography or data sets yet because we just don't have that content yet. So this is, I guess, the beginnings of what could be a shareable LTER website. But you can play with it if you really want to see what it's like to work with a static website. If I wanted to change this title to be some other LTER, what I would need to do is to go into that page. Here I am in my pile of files here, and I'll edit that with my text editor. Whoops, I minimized it, didn't I? There we go. And this is where you would need to know HTML so you know how to look through this thing and find where that heading is. There's my heading or H1 element. And so I can change that to whatever name I want for my LTER. I can refresh the page and now that name shows up here. But what if I don't like this blue banner? Well, things like styles on your website tend to be controlled by something called cascading style sheets. So to edit that, I'll go into my CSS folder for my website and then open up my app.css file and then find the element in here that's controlling that blue background color and change it to some other color and then refresh my page. And now I get wacky fuchsia showing up here. So it shows up in various places depending on where that style is defined or style is used. So that's what it takes to edit a static website. There are some editors out there where you don't have to necessarily know HTML and CSS. They can sort of tease that out for you and give you a more just plain text representation, like what you might be used to if you're editing a document in Microsoft Word, for example. But if you are going to go static, I do recommend learning HTML and CSS because it makes your life a lot easier whenever something isn't looking quite right. It's easier to understand how to get down into the weeds and fix that thing. I'll jump back to my slides now. So my website, the BLE website, is hosted with a company called Netlify. They are a free host for static websites. They give me that free SSL certificate so I have the secure transactions between my end users and my web server. Not that I need it yet, but eventually it might be nice if I'm going to let people log in, for example, to have security. Another set of things that Netlify does that sets them apart from the competition, and the reason why I chose them, are features like minifying your assets. I'll show you what this means. So you remember, let's see, that is the wrong page there actually. So you remember in my notepad window where I had the app.css file, this is my style sheet file. And you can sort of see the different rules here. There's a rule called lighter, a rule called darker, and they're all on different lines and it's easy for a human to read that. Well, let's go to the actual BLE website as hosted on Netlify, and I'll click to view the page source. And in here, you see a link for that style sheet. So there's app.css. But when I click that link, I see that now everything is on a single line. So what Netlify has done is taken out all the extra spaces and carriage returns and line feeds to make that CSS file as small as possible. And a human would have a terrible time reading this, but computers can do it just fine. And because that file is as small as possible, then transmitting that file to an end user, especially over slow connection, will still happen very quickly. This is the benefit of minifying your files. Netlify also does something called continuous deployment, which I'll show you on the next slide. And they do have their own content delivery network. That means my site is replicated on servers around the world, leading to greater reliability and faster performance. Continuous deployment is how Netlify is able to detect things that I do on my GitHub project for my site and turn that into reality. So if I want to edit my website, I'll get on GitHub and change a file and then commit that. And Netlify can automatically detect that change and show it on the actual live BLE website. When you work in GitHub, you work on projects, and projects can have different branches, which are like versions. And so there's always going to be a master branch. This is like your official version, your production version, your for realsies version of your website in this example. And that might be what I'm showing here on the top right of this slide, where I've got a blue banner at the top and a picture of a flood. Well, let's suppose that my PI for the BLE project wants to change our theme to green and change our font to make it more exciting and include a little magnifying glass that leads to a search function. Well, I don't want to corrupt my master or my production version of my site accidentally, and so I'll make a copy of that site in a branch on GitHub and make my changes there. Well, Netlify can detect those branches and automatically deploy them to a new URL so that your PIs can get onto that new and temporary URL just to see how your site might look and then approve those changes. And once approved, you can merge that branch back into your master copy, and that's what would then be on your production version. GitHub is a collaborative environment, and so if somebody else on my team or any Joe Schmo out there wants to help me edit my website, perhaps solve some bugs or just change the look of it, they can work on a copy of my website, and then when it's ready, they can submit what's called a pull request to my GitHub project. This pull request says, hey, I've made some changes and here's what they look like. Here's what I changed. Well, Netlify can detect your pull requests as well and automatically generate a unique URL to show a preview of what those changes would look like. And I might decide in this case that I don't want to use Comic Sans for my font and I don't want a picture of pizza for my LTER. So I might reject that pull request. But this is an example of what continuous deployment means and how Netlify uses it. So my basic publishing steps for my website are to put my files on GitHub. Then with my free Netlify account, I point Netlify to that GitHub project, and then Netlify generates some wacky URL where my website lives. But I tell the LTER Network Communications Office, and they set up what's called an alias. So that ble.lternet.edu, which is the domain that they maintain, now points back to that Netlify address. And so that's how whenever you go to ble.lternet.edu, it goes to my actual website. So I like the experience I had in setting up that website with Netlify and the overall static design, but I wanted to see that I was really getting the performance out of that website that was promised. Static websites are supposed to be fast. So to test that, I'm using a tool called Lighthouse. This is a free tool that's included with Google Chrome. And the basic procedure is you open up your website in Chrome, which I've done here. And then under your developer tools, you can click on the audits tab to perform an audit. I don't remember if Lighthouse is included by default in Chrome. You may have to install it for free, but it's out there. And a lot of folks use that to evaluate their website. And what it does is it simulates how your website will look on a mobile device over a 3G connection. And they test performance and a variety of other aspects. So performance is performance, how fast the page loads. Progressive web app is something that we don't have to worry about for this discussion. If there are any web developers out there and you want to talk about the next generation of apps and how they'll look for websites and mobile devices, we can talk about that some other time. Accessibility is how easy it is for people with impairments to navigate your site. Are you using the best practices on the web for your site? And finally, the last category is search engine optimization. So Chrome is performing that audit right now on my website. And when it finishes, it gives me those scores. So it looks like my website is a little bit sluggish today, but overall looking pretty good, still in the green. And the cool thing about Lighthouse is that it also tells you what you can do to fix problems on your website. So I can see here under performance, I've got an opportunity to do something called reduce render blocking style sheets. What that really means is I'm using Bootstrap. It's a framework for helping to develop web applications quickly. And I'm only using, if you look here under unused CSS rules, I'm only using 4% of what Bootstrap has to offer. So I'm downloading a whole bunch of extra stuff that I don't really need to whenever I go to my website. And if I were to manage that better, then I could reduce my page load times. but I still have a pretty good score of 89, and that's actually the slowest I've seen in the past 2 months. So I'm happy with how it is now, but I might work on Bootstrap or some alternative in the future. By the way, if you want to test out your website, all you have to do is to just visit your website and then click on those developer tools in Chrome on the audits tab, and then run this audit on your own site to see how you're doing. And when I first ran it on mine, my performance was okay, but the rest of these scores were terrible. But the benefit of having a static website, in my opinion, is that because Lighthouse tells you exactly what to fix, I can open up that CSS file and I can make that fix, save it, and then all of a sudden my scores go up. And that's how I was able to achieve these pretty good scores for the rest of these categories. So my conclusion is pretty happy with the LTER website experiment, although really it's still quite young. And I need to see how well the website would function once I have all the other bits that I'll add once the BLE project itself matures. Future work would also be to add social media icons and other stuff in the latest edition of the LTER website guidelines. I might want to trim my CSS and JavaScript so that I'm not downloading that giant Bootstrap file and either looking at an alternative or building my own custom small version of Bootstrap. I need to determine how best to share this on GitHub, if at all. At this point, I think the best thing to do would perhaps be to share those individual modules like the Pasta Plus client rather than the entire website, because everyone's going to want a different look and feel or require different pages for the website. And I don't know that a one-size-fits-all solution will be there. But if you just work on the individual modules, then you can plug those into whatever website you want. And as time permits, I want to check out these cool new things on the horizon, like static site generators. So a static site generator works much like WordPress or Drupal in that you have a data store sitting somewhere or a database, and then the generator will look through that database and build out your web pages. Except with a static generator, that happens on your own local machine, and you build your entire website all at once. Then you just upload your web pages to your server. The reason why you would do this is if you have more than, say, 10 pages in your website. If you want to make a change to your footer, then I don't want to go in and edit 10 individual pages. That's a whole lot of copying and pasting, and there's got to be a great room for error in that if I try that. Whereas if I have a static generator, it can insert the appropriate footer into all those pages for me. And you might think it's overkill to build your entire website anytime you want to make a little change like that. But as it turns out, static site generators are very fast. The one shown here called Hugo can generate over 1,000 web pages in less than a second. So it's not a big deal to make some little tweak and then recreate your entire website. And in this way, the web server is still just holding a pile of files. You still get those benefits of having a static website that doesn't have a live database. You can replicate it easily across a content delivery network and so on. However, I'm not using one of these currently, one of these static site generators, because this is a rapidly evolving field. I'm seeing some new contenders that look like they're going to knock off the old standbys like Jekyll and Hugo off their thrones. And I also only have 4 pages on my site, so I don't need one yet. But eventually, I'd like to look into these in more detail. I have tried a couple of these out in case you're curious and want to have an offline discussion about it. And then an even more nascent field is a content management system for static websites. So a user gets on their browser, they log in, they're able to edit the web pages in much the same way you edit web pages in WordPress. You don't have to deal with HTML code. You just type things out, change fonts as you please, and then the CMS will take care of generating everything for you. In this case, the CMS is hooked up to a static site generator, which spits things out to GitHub, which gets replicated in your content delivery network, and that becomes the holy grail of how I eventually think that the BLE website, at least, will be maintained. But this is still just becoming reality, these CMSs for static websites. Netlify, by the way, seems to have the best one out there right now, in my opinion. So I guess I'm even happier with Netlify because of that. But we'll see how things evolve. There are also some things out there for handling like logins on static websites, forms on static websites. If your users want to log in and submit data through your website, a static website can support that with other dynamic services that work much in the same way that the Pasta Plus API works, that Zotero works. You call on other servers to manage those dynamic elements for you within your website. There are also things called functions sitting out there. So if I have a data stream that comes in, there can be a little snippet of code sitting on an Amazon server out there, and it runs some process on that data stream. And lo and behold, my website is updated with the latest graph showing stream flow in my LTER site. So functions are just little bits of code that can run when they need to on servers. My overall conclusions with this static website are that, hey, this seems feasible, although it's really good to know HTML and CSS and maybe a little bit of JavaScript if you don't like the way that I've coded up my JavaScript examples. I rely on other services to provide the dynamic content, and currently the total operating cost per year for the BLE website is $0. I want to point out the design philosophy that I had in this. I'm keeping the static website fairly simple, and I rely on other services and servers like Zotero and Pasta Plus or the Arctic Data Center to fill in the blanks with the dynamic functionality that's required, and I can envision adding more of these little nodes in the future. And I'm also keeping the rest of my information management system separate from my static website. So the static website is just the public-facing part, and I believe that for BLE, I'm going to have data submission from my investigators be implemented with some separate piece. And that keeps my static website lightweight, more manageable, and more agile. I love to collaborate with any of you if you want to play with these tools. Especially, I'm looking for guinea pigs for Zotero and the data archives because I don't have publications and data sets yet, and we won't have any until, I mean, it could be a year from now before we have anything significant to play with. So if any of you want to try these things out, I'm happy to help work on the code with you, and we can see if we can get these modules hardened up. And you may have ideas for other modules that I could be working on in the meantime. Well, that's my webinar. I open the room for questions now.
Thank you, Tim, for the very interesting and passionate presentation.
Dwayne has a question, I think.
Yes. First, a comment, Tim. I think you've just raised the bar for EDI webinars from here on out. Outstanding job. But my question is, with regard to the static data catalog that uses the Pasta Plus search API, in order to support that, we needed to make a small tweak to the Pasta Plus web services to support something called CORS, cross-origin resource sharing. And I was just wondering if you could explain in simple terms, without going too deep into the weeds, what that is and why we needed to make that change to support your static website.
Dwayne, I think you probably know more about CORS than I do, but my understanding of it is if your web browser is looking at a given web page, you've got some content that came from some web server, like my content delivery network. But what if my web page wants to go out to another server out there, like the EDI server, the Pasta Plus server, to ask it for something to come back? Well, this can pose a potential security risk. And so for that transaction to happen, the server has to be CORS enabled. And Dwayne, you can tell them about the tweak that you had to make. I think it was just 1 or 2 lines, right? You had to adjust on your server settings to enable your server to either be open to a specific set of addresses or to make it open to anybody that wants to query your services.
Mark Sevilla actually made the change, I think, but maybe he could add some insight into what was actually tweaked. But yeah, I only know about as much about it as I found on Google.
Well, this perhaps, if you want to compare a static website to a dynamic website, this is an advantage that dynamic websites have. A dynamic website has a live, active, thinking server behind the scenes. And so when a user wants to query Pasta Plus, for example, the server can go out and do that work for you and take the information from Pasta Plus and deliver it back to the end user. And so to the end user, it looks like the data is just coming from the server itself. That's all they ever see. They don't see what the server was doing behind the scenes talking to your Pasta Plus server. They just see what their web server was doing. Whereas with a static site, you don't get that. It's the user's web browser directly that's going out and making that connection to the Pasta Plus server. And so that's why you've got to have that, you've got to have CORS enabled on that external server in order for static websites to work properly. And for all the examples that you saw here with Zotero, Pasta Plus, and Solar for the Arctic Data Center, they do all have cores enabled on their servers. That's why these examples work. If they didn't, they wouldn't work.
Tim, maybe could you unshare the screen?
Oh, yes.
So
Good
that
idea.
See the participants? Thank you.
Yeah.
So Margaret made a comment. She said, great job. And the SBC would like to develop a new web page, and maybe they can be your test field there. Margaret,
Yeah, it'd be fun. It'd be fun to look
see
at the
more?
SBC website.
Yeah, let me chime in. The SBC website is really, really old, but we don't have a person targeted yet to actually do all the work. So but I have to start pushing them along to get this done. So it'll be someone's time has to get dedicated to it. So we have to farm that out. But this is I think this would actually be a good thing for them to consider doing. I have a couple other questions, actually, if we have a few more minutes. One of the things that we use a Google search box right now, and it happens to index all the data sets too, which actually I really like. And we have about 200 data sets. And I think because these are dynamically delivered to the website, there's probably about, I think, 400 or 600 pages that those 200 data sets generate, maybe more like 1,000, because each data set has approximately 4 to 6 different views that come off of it. I think those would be considered individual pages. I'm thinking about your searching using Lunr instead of a Google box. Is that the size of a corpus of things to index that starts to get slow and difficult?
Yeah, I think it would be. There are some strategies you can use to manage Lunr. So what I was doing, what I am currently doing with my BLE website is I am having Lunr index every single relevant word, not if, and, or, the and a.
Yeah.
So I'm indexing every relevant word on my entire website. But what you can do instead is you can tell it to index just the meta description tags that are in the HTML. In other words, the summary of each page. And so you might miss some search terms, but if you've written your descriptions very well, you'll catch more of it.
Yeah.
When it comes to indexing the data sets, and so this will reduce your search index size.
Mm-hmm.
When it comes to indexing the data sets, you could decide whether or not you want that single search box to support your website search and your data catalog search all at once. If not, you could tell Lunr not to index your data set pages.
Okay.
I think it's actually kind of cool that you can search your data sets.
I know that I was so excited when I saw that because it did show up in Google searches too, not just on my local site, but in the world, which I thought was wonderful. So my other question had to do with Zotero actually, and and the goals that you set up, or that I think LTER sites set up different goals for what they want their management of publications to actually accomplish. One of the things that we would like it to do here is help with the annual reporting to NSF, which of this project the size of an LTER, keeping track of the list of publications actually can get really ugly. And I haven't found Zotero to work really well for that yet. So I'm curious about talk to somebody who's got more experience with it. Mine's pretty rudimentary. So things like I want to pull if a citation was in press and now I have page numbers. So what do I have to do to keep it up to date? Where do I keep information like, yes, this has been reported to NSF, but it's going to need an update in the next annual report round, things like that. Those are the kinds of tasks that we end up trying to keep track of. And our site generates approximately, I'm not even sure. I think we have about 1,000 publications now. So maybe that's around 100 per year. So they can pile up. It's just, and so anyway, so I'm not sure yet that what's the best solution. What we're using now is a combination of Postgres and actually EML. All my citations have EML representation, EML records too. So.
Well, I will defer commenting on that to somebody that actually has a Zotero account. I don't even have an account. I've just been I've been playing with the LTERs account since
So I think what that account is, I think that's even a test account. They're trying it out for using it at the network level. I'm not sure how that's working for them yet, because I don't know how individual sites make contributions to it.
I'm on the call, Margaret.
Oh, I'm ready. You can answer that question.
I can at least partially answer that question. We're trying to figure out whether there are enough free categories in Zotero to track those sorts of things, and what sorts of things it is that people actually want to keep track of. But it may end up being a trade-off. It may end up being that it's worth it to put your content in Zotero because that's easy to display on the network site. It'll be easier to display if I can work out Tim's system, but because it's easier to display on the network site, and we can sort of feed those references back to you, but that you have to maintain the additional information locally. We really aren't sure how that'll sort out yet. But everybody wants to do it a little differently.
Mm-hmm. I know, and I think that's always been a problem. And I don't think anyone is particularly wedded to anything they've already got, which is probably a good thing. I think that doesn't work all that great. It's really cumbersome and arcane.
And I think there's a lot of value in using a system that does tie into standard references, so that you can pretty straightforwardly just search and add references to, either by a DOI or whatever other sorts of information, as opposed to having to enter them one by one.
And what I think a lot of sites end up with is duplicate lists. Somebody does
and at the network level, you can only imagine how that multiplies.
Well, I know one site that has one person who keeps track of the list for the annual reports. It's another place where it ends up on the website, and the third place where beats me why they have a third one, but they do. I can't remember.
Right. So at the network level, we end up with your preprint, your final publication, plus copies of those for every site that thought that they had some involvement with that publication. So we often end up with 20 references to the same publication.
Oh, joy. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, yeah. So that's I think maybe it's even messier than data. No, I don't think it's messier than data. Okay.
Definitely not messier than data, but some of the same solutions, hopefully.
Well, it'll be interesting to see how Zotero plays out. If that will do it for us, that'd be great.
Yeah. I wish EndNote were better at web display, because I think it would be a more straightforward solution network-wide, but I haven't seen that yet.
Marty, as you or anyone else wants to play with the things that you've seen today, please don't be a stranger.
Absolutely.
There was one site that I found out they said, Tim, I've been working on this for days and I just can't figure this out. And I said, oh, it's just one line right here. Just change that and it works. So don't be a stranger. Don't spend days or even hours on this. If you want to play with this, let me know. And then.
Okay. We should get on a Zoom together.
Mm-hmm.